The ink on the contract is still drying. I just sold the house, the very one my daughter and her husband thought they had already stolen from me. Right now, they probably picture me as a defeated old man, sitting alone in my worn leather armchair waiting for their final, crushing blow. But they are profoundly wrong. What they did wasn't just about the $250,000 they demanded from me on that awful afternoon. It was an attempt to erase my entire history, to wipe away every memory I built with my late wife Helen within these four walls. They thought they were so clever, so ruthless. But in their haste and their greed, they overlooked one small detail in the papers they shoved in my face. A detail that will unravel everything they've built on lies. The story I'm about to share is how their cruelty forged a quiet carpenter into something they never, ever saw coming. If you like this story, please like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share your impressions about this story in the comments. You're going to want to see how this ends. For 40 years, my hands knew the language of wood. The grain of oak was a stubborn old story, pine was a soft-spoken youth, and cherry was a poem. My workshop was my sanctuary, a place where the air was thick with the scent of cedar and my own quiet thoughts. But after Helen passed, the silence in that big space became too loud. So last fall, I sold it. I traded the hum of the table saw for the gentle tick-tock of the grandfather clock in my hallway, and my life's work was converted into a number in a bank account. $301, $254 to be exact. It wasn't for me. It was a safety net, a final gift I could leave for my daughter Sarah. At 68, my needs were simple. All I truly cherished couldn't be bought. My days began and ended in the same place, a deep burgundy leather armchair that sat by the living room window. The morning sun would spill across its worn arms, warming the cracks in the leather that mapped out my life with Helen. It was in this chair that I'd read bedtime stories to Sarah, her small head resting against my chest. It was here that Helen and I drank tea on rainy Sunday afternoons, our feet propped up on the matching ottoman, her laughter filling the small room. The chair still held the faintest scent of her rose perfume, a ghost of a fragrance that clung to the leather, a comforting presence that told me I wasn't entirely alone. Every evening I'd sit there and look at her photograph on the mantel, her smile as bright as the day we met, and I'd feel a sense of peace. This house wasn't just wood and nails. It was a living album of our family. Every corner held a memory. The slight dip in the kitchen floorboards was from the spot where Helen always stood to bake her famous apple pies. The scent of cinnamon and cloves forever baked into the memory of this house. The pencil marks on the doorframe in the hallway still track Sarah's growth, from a wobbly toddler to a young woman ready to leave for college. I had built the bookshelves in the study myself the very day we brought Sarah home from the hospital. I remembered sanding each shelf until it was as smooth as silk, imagining the stories and dreams they would one day hold for her. These weren't just things, they were anchors. They were proof of a life well lived, a love that had been real and abundant. My existence had become a quiet ritual of tending to these memories, of keeping the dust off the frames and the floors polished, as if preserving the past was my final, most important job. I thought I had done right by Sarah. I'd given her and Mark the down payment for their first house, a generous $45,000 gift that I was happy to provide. When Mark's first can't-miss business idea went under, I quietly paid off the $18,700 debt he'd accumulated, sparing Sarah the worry. I did it because that's what a father does. You build a foundation for your children, you patch the cracks when they appear, and you hope they learn to stand on their own. I saw the expensive cars and the designer clothes they favored, and a small, quiet part of me felt a prickle of unease. Mark always seemed to be chasing a shortcut, a get-rich-quick scheme that felt as flimsy as particle board. But Sarah seemed happy, and her happiness was the architecture of my own peace. So I pushed my doubts down, convincing myself it was just an old man's caution, a relic from a time when you built things to last. My routine was simple, predictable. I'd wake with the sun, make a pot of strong black coffee, and sit in my armchair with the newspaper. Some afternoons, I'd go out to the garage, where I still kept a small workbench and a few hand tools. I'd repair a neighbor's wobbly chair or build a small birdhouse for the garden. The familiar motion of planing a piece of wood, the curl of the shavings falling to the floor, was a kind of meditation. It connected me to the man I had always been. Life was no longer a grand project, but a series of small, satisfying tasks. It was a quiet life, a solitary one, but it was mine. I felt a sense of contentment in its rhythm, a feeling that I had earned this tranquility after decades of hard work. I believed the storms were all behind me. I had no idea the hurricane was just about to make landfall, right in my own living room. The first signs were small, like hairline fractures in a solid piece of timber. At first, you dismiss them, telling yourself it's just the wood settling. It started a few months after I sold the workshop. Sarah and Mark began visiting more often, which initially warmed my old heart. But their visits had changed. They no longer felt like the easy, comfortable gatherings we used to have when Helen was alive. There was an agenda humming just beneath the surface, a low-frequency tension that made the air in the house feel heavy. Mark, especially, had developed a new habit of walking through the rooms with a critical eye, as if he were an inspector and my home was a property he was considering flipping. One Sunday afternoon, he was standing in my living room, swirling a glass of iced tea, his eyes scanning the walls. "You know, Frank," he said, his voice casual, "you are sitting on a gold mine here." I was in my armchair reading the paper, and I lowered it slowly. "It's my home, Mark. Not a gold mine." He chuckled, a short, dismissive sound. "I just mean the property value. This neighborhood has gone through the roof. An open-concept renovation. Maybe knock down that wall into the kitchen. You could easily add another $100,000 to the asking price." Sarah, who was setting out some cookies Helen's recipe book, just smiled weakly. "Mark, stop talking shop. Dad doesn't care about that." But she didn't look at me when she said it. She was defending me with words, but her posture was allied with him. The comments became more frequent, more pointed. A few weeks later, they came over for dinner. As I was carving the roast chicken, a meal I'd made for them 100 times, Mark gestured around the dining room with his fork. It's a great space, but it's so dated. The wallpaper. The dark wood. It's not what buyers are looking for these days. I placed a piece of chicken on his plate and met his gaze. My voice was level. "I'm not a buyer, Mark. I live here." A flicker of annoyance crossed his face before he masked it with a smooth smile. "Of course, Frank. I'm just thinking about the future. Your future. Making sure you're comfortable." The word, comfortable, felt like a threat, as if my current comfort was somehow insufficient or wrong. The most jarring moment came on a Tuesday. I was out in the garden trimming the rose bushes Helen had planted when their sleek black SUV pulled into my driveway. They hadn't called. Sarah came out to the garden, her phone pressed to her ear, while Mark walked right past me and into the house as if he owned it. I followed him in, my muddy boots leaving prints on the welcome mat. He was in the study, my study, running his hand over the bookshelves I had built for my infant daughter. "I was just telling Sarah," he said, not even turning to look at me, "that this room would make a perfect home office. We'd just need to clear out all this old stuff." He gestured vaguely at the shelves, at the rows of books and the framed photos of Helen and a little girl with missing front teeth. My blood ran cold. He wasn't just talking about furniture. He was talking about my life, dismissing it as clutter. I stood in the doorway, my hands clenched at my sides. "This old stuff is my family's history," I said. My voice was quiet, but it carried the weight of every memory in that room. For the first time, Mark looked directly at me, and there was no pretense in his eyes. Just a cold, hard impatience. "History doesn't pay the bills, Frank," he said flatly. Sarah walked in then, finishing her call. She saw the tension between us, the rigid way I was standing. "What's going on?" she asked, her tone already defensive. "Your dad is being a little sentimental," Mark said, his voice dripping with condescension. He walked over to her and put an arm around her shoulder, pulling her to his side. "I was just making some suggestions for improvements." Sarah looked from him to me, her expression torn. "Dad, he's just trying to help," she said, but her voice lacked conviction. It was the plea of someone who knew something was wrong but had already chosen a side. They left soon after that, the air thick with unspoken words. I walked back into the study and ran my hand over the same bookshelf Mark had touched. The wood felt cold, violated. It was the first time I felt like a stranger in my own home, the first time I realized they didn't see a father or a home, they saw an asset. And an obstacle. That afternoon the phone rang. It was Sarah. Her voice was unusually cheerful, almost strained. "Hi, Dad. Mark and I were just in the neighborhood. We have a little surprise for you. Can we stop by in about 20 minutes? A warmth spread through my chest, a foolish, fatherly hope that perhaps things were turning a corner. "Of course, sweetheart," I said. "I'll put the coffee on." I went to the kitchen and took out the good Colombian beans, the ones she loved, and filled the percolator. The rich, dark aroma soon filled the house, a scent of welcome and normalcy. I carefully placed Helen's 2 favorite porcelain cups, the ones with the delicate blue flowers painted on the rims, on a tray. I imagined them bringing news of a promotion, or maybe, finally, a grandchild. They arrived looking like they'd stepped out of a magazine, but their smiles were brittle, like thin veneers stretched over something ugly. Sarah avoided my eyes as she handed me a thick manila envelope. "Here, Dad, this is for you." Her voice was too high, too bright. My hands, clumsy with age and anticipation, fumbled with the metal clasp. I pulled out a thick stack of papers. It wasn't a sonogram or a cruise itinerary. It was a loan agreement, filled with dense legal text. On the top page, a single horrifying number was circled in thick red ink, $250,000. I looked up from the page, my throat suddenly dry. The ticking of the grandfather clock in the hall seemed to grow louder, each tick a hammer blow against the sudden silence. What is this?" I managed to ask, my gaze fixed on Sarah. Mark, who had been standing by the mantelpiece with his arms crossed, finally spoke. He stepped forward, his expensive cologne overwhelming the scent of coffee, a chemical invasion in my quiet home. "It's a business debt, Frank," he said. His tone was flat, clinical, as if he were discussing the weather. "One of my angel investors pulled out unexpectedly. We're in a tight spot." He paused, letting the weight of his words settle. "It needs to be paid in full by Monday, or we lose everything." Everything. The word hung in the air. I looked down at the number again. $250,000. It was nearly all of it. Nearly every splinter of wood I had ever planed. Every drop of sweat that had fallen on my workshop floor for 40 years. I shook my head slowly, looking from the paper to my daughter's face, searching for the little girl who used to fall asleep in my armchair. "Sarah, I can't," I whispered. "This is my retirement. It's all I have left." That's when she broke. The mask of strained cheerfulness shattered, and something cold and ugly took its place. Her face hardened, her eyes narrowing into slits of resentment I had never seen before. "You can't?" she snapped, her voice sharp and contemptuous. "After everything we've done for you? All the time we spend checking in on you, making sure you're okay in this big, empty house." The sheer, breathtaking injustice of her words stole the air from my lungs. The down payment, the debts I'd paid, the endless support, all of it erased. In her mind, I was the burden. I was the one who owed them. I just stared at her, my heart a cold, heavy stone in my chest. I saw Mark's smug satisfaction reflected in her eyes. He had done this. He had twisted my daughter into this stranger. In a single, violent motion, she grabbed her coffee cup from the tray. "You are so selfish," she shrieked. And she threw it. The hot, dark liquid flew through the air and hit my chest with a searing shock. It wasn't the burn that made me gasp. It was the act itself. The coffee cascaded down my shirt, dripping onto the worn, burgundy leather of my armchair, Helen's chair. A dark, ugly stain began to spread across the very spot where she used to rest her head. I looked down at the desecrated leather, then back up at my daughter. My daughter. The clock ticked. The coffee dripped. And in that moment, something inside me went quiet. The pain was still there, a vast, hollow cavern, but around it, something else was forming. Something cold and hard and clear. Mark stepped forward, his face a mask of disgust. "Get out," he snarled, pointing a finger at me. "Just sign the papers and get out. This is our house now, anyway." He grabbed Sarah's arm and pulled her toward the door. They stormed out, leaving it wide open behind them, letting the cold November air rush in and extinguish the last bit of warmth in the room. I didn't move. I just sat there in my soiled shirt in my stained chair and watched the steam rise from the cooling coffee on the floor. The old man they thought they were robbing was gone. He died right there in that chair. And someone else, someone they had never met, was just beginning to take his place. I sat there for a long time after the front door slammed shut. The silence they left behind was heavier than their shouting had been. Cold air snaked across the floor from the open doorway, chilling the dampness on my shirt where the coffee had soaked through. My skin stung, a dull, persistent burn, but I barely felt it. My eyes were fixed on the dark, ugly stain marring the burgundy leather of my armchair. It was a jagged shape, like a wound, right where Helen's head used to rest when she'd doze off while reading. The rich aroma of coffee, a scent I had always associated with warm welcomes and quiet mornings, now smelled like betrayal. It was the smell of the end of something. I didn't cry. The tears were there, somewhere deep inside, but they were frozen solid. The shock that had ripped through me was now cooling, hardening into something else entirely. It was a strange and unfamiliar feeling, a stillness that settled over me like a sheet of ice. The pain was immense, a gaping hole where my love for my daughter had been. But around that void, a new structure was being built. It was cold, logical, and precise. It was the mind of a carpenter taking over, the part of me that sees a problem not as a disaster, but as a set of measurements and angles that need to be addressed. They had shattered my world, but they had left me with all the pieces. My movements were slow, deliberate. I leaned forward, my joints creaking in protest, and pushed myself out of the chair. I walked to the front door, my feet silent on the hardwood floor, and I closed it. The click of the latch echoed in the quiet house, a sound of finality. I had just shut them out, not just from my home, but from my heart. I turned and saw the manila envelope lying on the floor where it had been dropped. I bent down, picked it up, and walked to the dining room table. My hands, which had been trembling just minutes before, were now perfectly steady as I pulled out the papers. I smoothed them out on the polished wood surface. $250,000. The numbers stared up at me, no longer an impossible demand, but a declaration of war. Their signatures, Mark's a confident, arrogant scrawl, Sarah's a hesitant imitation of it, were at the bottom. They saw an old man, a widower lost in his memories, a soft piece of wood to be carved up and discarded. They believed I was too weak, too sentimental, too broken to fight back. In their greed, they had mistaken my love for weakness and my quiet nature for foolishness. They had no idea who I was. They had never known the man who built this house with his own two hands, the man who knew that the strongest structures are built with patience, precision, and a solid, unshakable foundation. They weren't going to see this coming. The officers left as quietly as they had arrived, their footsteps echoing on the porch before the silence of the house folded back in on itself. They had been professional, even sympathetic after I showed them the paperwork. They took a brief statement, advised me to contact a lawyer, and handed me a card with a case number on it. Sarah and Mark had already gone. Their performance for the police concluded. I was alone again, but the air in the room had changed. The shock had burned away, leaving behind something hard and clear like tempered steel. The house was no longer a tomb of memories. It was a fortress, and I was its sole defender. My gaze fell once more on the dark, ugly stain on my armchair. It was a violation, a desecration, but it was also evidence. Before I did anything else, I went to the kitchen and returned with a bowl of warm water, a soft cloth, and a bottle of leather cleaner. The acrid chemical smell of the cleaner cut through the lingering scent of coffee. I knelt on the floor, the old bones in my knees protesting, and began to work on the stain. My movements were slow, methodical, the way I would approach a piece of difficult wood. I worked the cleaner into the leather in small, tight circles, my knuckles rubbing against the worn fabric. With each pass of the cloth, I wasn't just lifting a stain, I was erasing them. I was scrubbing away the memory of my daughter's face twisted in contempt, of Mark's sneering voice declaring my home was his. The physical act was a ritual. It focused my mind, channeling the chaotic storm of grief and rage into a single, productive task. It took nearly an hour, But finally, the stain was gone, leaving only a faint discoloration that only I would ever notice. It would serve as a permanent reminder. I stood up, my back aching, and looked at the clean chair. My chair. Helen's chair. I had taken the first piece of my life back. The next morning, I was awake before the sun. I didn't sit in the armchair. Instead, I stood by the window with my coffee, watching the gray light of dawn creep over the neighborhood. I felt a clarity I hadn't experienced in years. By 8:30 a.m., I was on the phone. I didn't look for a big, expensive law firm downtown. I searched for a small, local practice, someone who understood this town and its people. I found a name, Peterson and Associates. The man who answered the phone had a calm, no-nonsense voice. I explained my situation briefly, without emotion. I need a consultation regarding a matter of financial fraud and a property dispute. There was a pause. I can see you on Wednesday, November 18th at 2 p.m. The initial consultation is $350 for the hour. I didn't hesitate. I'll be there, I said, and wrote the details down on a notepad next to the phone. The appointment was set. The first gear of my plan had engaged. My next stop was the bank. The First Community Bank on Elm Street, where Helen and I had opened our first joint account in 1978. I walked in and went to the same teller I'd been dealing with for 20 years, a kind woman named Martha. I had the bank statement for the account, where the money from my workshop sale was sitting, account number 409228841. Total balance, $301, 254.19. Sarah's name was still on it as a secondary user, a foolish, sentimental decision I had made after Helen died, thinking it would make things easier for her, in case something happened. I saw now that something had happened. Martha, I said, my voice steady, I need to close this account immediately, and I want to transfer the entire balance to a new checking account, in my name only. No secondary users, no transfer on death beneficiary. Just me. She looked at me over her glasses, a flicker of concern in her eyes, but she didn't ask questions. She just nodded. The process took 20 minutes. I signed 3 forms, showed my driver's license twice, and walked out with a receipt for the transfer and a new checkbook for account number 612515509. The money was safe. The second gear clicked into place. On Wednesday, I sat across a polished mahogany desk from Arthur Peterson. He was a man my age, with sharp eyes and a quiet confidence that put me at ease. I laid everything out on his desk. The loan agreement Mark and Sarah had tried to force on me, my bank statements showing the transfers to pay off Mark's previous debts, and a printed record of the business registry showing that Mark's company, Innovatech Solutions LLC, had been legally dissolved on May 12th of that year. Mr. Peterson listened without interruption, his fingers steepled under his chin. He read every page carefully. When he was finished, he looked up at me, and for the first time, I saw a flash of anger in his eyes. "Mr. Thompson," he said, his voice level but firm, "this isn't just a family squabble. This is attempted fraud, extortion even. The document is worthless. Securing a loan against a non-existent asset is a textbook case." He leaned back in his chair. "They were counting on you being too intimidated or too heartbroken to look closely. They miscalculated." The validation was like a cool drink of water on a scorching day. "So, what do we do?" I asked. Mr. Peterson laid out the plan, step by logical step. First, a cease and desist letter, delivered by courier to their home address, demanding they make no further contact with me and cease all claims against my property. Second, we would file a civil fraud complaint with the county court, officially documenting their actions. He scribbled a note. "We'll file it tomorrow morning. It will be assigned a docket number, something like 72C-2023. It becomes a public record." Finally, he advised a temporary restraining order, citing their aggressive behavior and the false police report. "It will legally bar them from coming within 500 feet of you or your property. The police call they made will actually help us here. It establishes a pattern of harassment." I felt a weight lift from my shoulders. It was a plan. A real, legal, and powerful plan. I wrote a check for $3,500. A retainer for his services. It was a lot of money, but it felt like the best investment I had ever made. I walked out of his office into the cold afternoon air, the sky a clear, brilliant blue. For the first time since that terrible day, I didn't feel like a victim. I felt like a carpenter again, with a blueprint in my hand and a set of sharp tools at my disposal. They wanted to tear my house down. They were about to find out I knew how to build something much stronger in its place. The day after my meeting with Mr. Peterson, the plan began to move. At exactly 9:15 a.m., a professional courier service I'd hired, Swift Deliveries, dispatched a messenger to 415 Willow Creek Lane, the address I had helped my daughter and her husband secure years ago. Inside the crisp, waterproof envelope were 3 documents, each a carefully forged link in a chain they would never see until it was wrapped around them. The first was the cease and desist letter, formally ordering them to halt all contact. The second was a filed copy of the civil complaint for fraud, stamped with the official docket number from the county court, 72C-2023. The third, and most immediate, was the temporary restraining order, signed by a judge that very morning, legally prohibiting them from coming within 500 feet of my person or my property. I didn't watch the delivery myself. Instead, I sat in my kitchen, sipping a cup of black coffee, imagining the sharp knock on their door, a sound that would mark the precise moment their world began to tilt on its axis. The reaction was immediate and exactly as I had anticipated. My phone, which I had placed on the kitchen counter, began to vibrate just before 10 a.m. It didn't stop for nearly 2 hours. I didn't answer. I let every call go to voicemail, a silent testament to my new resolve. Later that evening, I listened to the messages. There were 17 missed calls from Sarah and 8 from Mark. Her first few messages were frantic, confused. "Dad, what is this? This has to be a mistake. Call me back." Then they turned pleading, then angry, her voice cracking with a theatrical desperation that I now saw for the performance it was. "How could you do this to your family? After everything? You're tearing us apart." Mark's messages were different. They were short, clipped, and laced with a venomous fury. "You're making a huge mistake, old man," one of them growled. "You have no idea who you're dealing with. You'll regret this." I saved every single message, each one a digital recording of their true character, another piece of evidence for the file Mr. Peterson was building. They were acting just as he predicted, like cornered animals, lashing out blindly, making my case for me with every word they spoke. The next day, I drove to the First Community Bank and asked to access my safe deposit box, number 34B. The air in the vault was cold and still, smelling of old paper and steel. I slid the long metal box from its slot and carried it to a private viewing room. Inside, beneath a few pieces of Helen's jewelry that I could never bear to part with, was my life on paper. The original deed to my house, dated October 2nd, 1978, signed in my strong young hand and Helen's elegant script. Her last will and testament, leaving everything to me and then to Sarah upon my passing. I took out every document related to my property and my finances. I spent $28.50 at a copy shop down the street, making 3 complete sets of everything. 1 set went back into the vault. 1 set I took home. The third I had couriered directly to Arthur Peterson's office, along with a note, "For our records." I was leaving nothing to chance. Every move I made was now documented, duplicated, and secured. My final act of fortification was the most painful. Sarah and I still had a small joint savings account, one I'd opened for her when she was a teenager to teach her about money. It held a balance of $12, $451.82, money I had slowly added to over the years, a nest egg I'd imagined she might use for a down payment on a car or a trip abroad. I walked up to Martha's teller window, the same one from which I'd secured my main retirement fund. "Martha," I said quietly, "I need to close account 778430119. She saw the joint names on the screen and her professional smile faltered for just a second. She saw the pain in my eyes. "Of course, Frank," she said softly. She processed the transaction, counted out the cash, and slid it under the glass to me. I took the stack of bills and immediately deposited the entire sum into my new, sole owner account, number 612515509. The receipt felt heavy in my hand. I had just severed the last financial thread that connected me to my daughter. The foundation was now clean. It was mine, and mine alone. A week later, a thick envelope arrived from a law firm I didn't recognize. Finch and Gable, attorneys at law. It was their response. The letter was a masterpiece of arrogant legalese, clearly dictated by Mark. It accused me of senile confusion and being subjected to undue influence from predatory outside parties. A clear jab at Mr. Peterson. It dismissed my fraud claim as frivolous and slanderous, and stated that their clients, Sarah and Mark, had been acting only out of deep concern for my well-being and the responsible management of my assets. The letter concluded with a demand. I was to drop my restraining order and civil suit immediately and agree to a family mediation session, where we could discuss the, quote, orderly transfer of the property title to them. They were doubling down. They still believed they held all the cards. They thought a few threatening words on expensive letterhead would make the old man crumble. I read the letter twice, then folded it neatly and put it in the file for Mr. Peterson. They had just handed us more ammunition. That letter was the final push I needed. They didn't just want my money. They were actively trying to strip me of my home and my dignity, painting me as an incompetent old fool. My next call was not to my lawyer, but to Susan Miller, a real estate agent who had helped a neighbor sell his house last spring. She was a sharp, no-nonsense woman in her 50s with a reputation for getting things done quickly and quietly. She came to the house the next day, on December 1st. I walked her through each room, the same rooms Mark had criticized. She saw not dated wallpaper, but good bones and a well-maintained property. "This house has a wonderful feel, Frank," she said kindly. We sat at the kitchen table, and I laid out my terms. "I want to sell," I said, "and I want to do it fast. I want to list it at a price that will attract serious, immediate offers. I don't want an open house. Private showings only, to pre-qualified buyers." She nodded, understanding the need for discretion. We agreed on a listing price of $425,000. She estimated we would have an offer within 2 weeks. I signed the listing agreement, her commission set at 5% of the final sale price. Preparing the house for sale was the hardest part. Susan had advised me to depersonalize the space, to pack away the family photos and personal keepsakes so potential buyers could envision their own lives there. I spent a weekend carefully wrapping each framed photograph in tissue paper and placing it in a box. The photo of Helen from the mantel was the last one I packed. I held it for a long time before wrapping it and placing it gently on top of the others. Then came the armchair. I couldn't bear the thought of strangers sitting in it, of their hands on the worn leather where Helen's had rested. I couldn't sell it, and I couldn't leave it. So I bought a thick white canvas dropcloth. I draped it carefully over the entire chair and the matching ottoman, smoothing it down until the familiar burgundy shape was completely obscured. It looked like a ghost sitting by the window, a silent, shrouded monument to a life that was being packed away. It was a painful, necessary act of preservation. I was protecting my most sacred memory from the cold, transactional process that was about to begin. The for sale sign went up in my front yard on a cold, gray Tuesday morning. The sound of the hammer driving the post into the frozen ground was loud and final. I watched from the living room window as the realtor, a young man from Susan's office, positioned it perfectly. The bold red and white of the sign was a jarring splash of color against the quiet landscape of my life. I knew they would see it. They lived only 10 minutes away. They would have to drive past it eventually. It was a public declaration, not of defeat, but of my own agency. They thought they were fighting to take the house from me in a courtroom. They had no idea I was already selling it out from under them, on my own terms. The fight they were preparing for was already obsolete. They were playing checkers, focused on jumping my pieces. They didn't realize I was playing chess, and I was about to put their king in check. Just as Susan predicted, the plan moved with incredible speed. We had 3 showings in the first week. On December 11th, we received an offer. A young couple, a doctor and a teacher, who had fallen in love with the garden. They offered $430,000, $10,000 over the asking price, with a quick closing date of January 15th. They had pre-approved financing and were willing to waive most contingencies. It was a perfect offer. I sat at my dining room table, the same table where my family had shared 1,000 meals, and signed the contract. My hand didn't shake. The ink flowed smoothly from the pen, a dark, definitive line that sealed their fate. The house was sold. The closing was less than a month away. Sarah and Mark were still sending threatening letters through their lawyer, completely oblivious. They were fighting over an empty castle, unaware that the king had already packed his treasures and was quietly walking out the back gate. The trap was set. All I had to do now was wait for them to walk into it. It took exactly 9 days for the sold banner to be slapped across the for sale sign on my lawn. Susan had called me on the morning of December 20th to give me the news that the buyer's financing was officially approved and all contingencies were cleared. An hour later, her assistant came by and added the bold red sticker. I watched him from the living room window, my hand resting on the shrouded form of Helen's armchair. Each letter of the word sold was a nail in the coffin of their scheme. The house was no longer a theoretical asset in a legal battle. It was a closed deal, a tangible reality that was about to collide with their fantasy. I knew they would see it soon. Their preferred route to the highway passed right by my street. I didn't have to wait long. The explosion came 2 days before Christmas. I was at the local supermarket, picking up a few things for a quiet holiday meal for one. The air was filled with the sounds of stressed shoppers and cheerful, tinny Christmas music. I was in aisle 7, comparing the prices of canned cranberries, when I heard my name. It wasn't spoken, it was hissed. "Dad." I turned slowly. Sarah was standing there, her face pale and pinched, her designer coat looking out of place next to the stacked cans of pumpkin pie filling. Mark was a few feet behind her, his arms crossed tightly, his jaw working as if he were chewing nails. He looked like a thundercloud about to burst. Sarah took a step closer, her eyes scanning the aisle to see who might be listening. "What have you done?" she whispered, her voice trembling with a rage she was trying to contain. "We drove by. We saw the sign." I placed a can of cranberries into my cart with a steady hand, the small metallic thud echoing in the small space between us. "The house was mine to sell, Sarah," I said, my voice even and calm. I met her gaze directly. The little girl I once knew was nowhere to be found in those eyes. All I saw was a stranger's fury. "Your house?" she scoffed, her voice rising. "That was supposed to be my house. Our family home." "It stopped being a family home the day you threw coffee on your mother's chair and tried to swindle your father out of his life savings," I replied. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. The truth was heavy enough. Her face flushed a deep, ugly red. She was speechless, her mouth opening and closing as she searched for a response. That's when Mark could no longer contain himself. He strode forward, pushing past a woman looking for green beans, and got right in my face. The restraining order meant nothing to him in that moment. His arrogance was its own law. "You think you're so smart, don't you, old man?" he snarled, his voice low and menacing. "You can't do this. We have a claim. That property is tied up in a legal dispute you started." I looked at him, at his expensive haircut and his furious, entitled face, and I felt nothing but a profound, weary pity. He was a child throwing a tantrum. "There is no dispute, Mark," I said calmly. "There is only a fraudulent document you and my daughter created, and a civil complaint against you that is proceeding as planned. Docket number 72C 2023. You can look it up." The mention of the specific docket number seemed to physically jolt him. It was real. It was a number he couldn't bully or lie his way out of. "Our lawyer will tear you apart," he threatened, jabbing a finger toward my chest. "You will lose everything." I simply pushed my cart forward a few inches, creating space between us. "I already lost everything that mattered to me on November 15th, I said, looking past him to Sarah. "This is just business. Now, if you'll excuse me, I believe you're violating a court order." I turned my cart and began to walk away, the squeaky wheel a comical soundtrack to their silent, impotent rage. I didn't look back. I just continued my shopping, leaving them standing there, defeated, in the canned goods aisle. The final act of their desperation came 3 days after the new year. My lawyer, Mr. Peterson, called me. "Frank, I've just gotten off the phone with Mr. Gable, their attorney," he said. There was a note of amusement in his voice. "They've realized the sale is legitimate and closing soon. They're panicking." He paused. "They've sent over a settlement offer. It's remarkable." I sat down in my kitchen chair, listening. "They are willing," Mr. Peterson read, his voice dry, "to drop all claims to the property and withdraw their concerns about your competency. In exchange, they are asking for a one-time payment of $150,000 from the proceeds of the sale, and for you to formally drop the civil fraud complaint." I almost laughed. It was the desperate gambit of a losing player trying to bluff with an empty hand. They were offering to stop robbing me if I paid them a handsome fee for their trouble. "Tell them no, Arthur," I said. "Tell them my only counteroffer is that I will see them in court on the scheduled date." There was a satisfying silence on the other end of the line before he said, "I was hoping you'd say that. I'll draft the refusal immediately." The closing date was January 15th, just 10 days away. They were running out of moves, and soon they would be out of time. The final day came on January 15th, a day of brilliant, cold sunshine that made the frost on the bare tree branches glitter like diamonds. The house was empty. The rooms echoed with every footstep, the walls bare except for pale rectangles where pictures had hung for 40 years. The air smelled of fresh paint and lemon-scented floor polish, a sterile scent that had erased the familiar comfort of sawdust and roses. All my boxes were in a storage unit, except for one small suitcase by the door. I had arranged for a moving company to retrieve the shrouded armchair later that afternoon. It was going with me to the small, clean apartment I had already leased across town. But before I left for good, there was one last piece of business. At 9:30 a.m., I sent a single text message to Sarah's phone. "I am at the house. If you want to talk about this before it goes any further, be here at 10 o'clock. Come alone." I knew she wouldn't come alone, and I knew they would come. Their arrogance wouldn't let them resist what they would perceive as a final chance to intimidate me into submission. They pulled into the driveway at exactly 10:02 a.m. in Mark's sleek, black SUV. I watched them from the living room window, standing in the empty space where my armchair used to be. They walked up the path, Mark a step ahead of Sarah, his shoulders squared, his face a mask of grim determination. They thought they were walking into a negotiation where I had finally broken. I opened the door before they could knock. I said nothing, just stepped back and let them in. They stopped in the entryway, their eyes sweeping over the vacant rooms. A slow, triumphant smile spread across Mark's face. He misinterpreted the emptiness as a sign of my surrender, believing I was already being forced out. "Well, well," he said, his voice echoing unnaturally in the hollow space. "Looks like you're finally seeing reason. It's a shame it had to get this messy." Sarah stood behind him, her arms wrapped around herself, looking at the bare walls with an expression I couldn't quite read. It wasn't remorse. Not yet. It was a kind of bewildered loss, as if she was only now realizing what was gone. "Let's cut the theatrics, Frank," Mark continued, taking a step into the living room, his expensive shoes clicking on the polished hardwood. "Our lawyer's offer of $150,000 is off the table. You've caused us too much trouble, but we are prepared to be generous. You sign the house over to us, drop the ridiculous fraud complaint, and we'll give you $50,000 for your moving expenses. You can find a nice little apartment somewhere. It's the best deal you're gonna get." He spoke as if he were closing a business deal, as if my entire life was a line item on his ledger. I let the silence hang in the air for a long moment, letting his words dissipate into the emptiness. Then I spoke. My voice was quiet, but it carried to every corner of the room. "There is no deal, Mark." I looked from his confused face to my daughter's. "The house was sold on December 11th for $430,000. The sale officially closes in less than an hour at the title office downtown." The color drained from Mark's face. Sarah just stared at me, her mouth slightly open. "You're lying," Mark sputtered, a flicker of panic in his eyes. "You can't sell it. It's a contested asset. We would have been notified. Our lawyer will stop it." I shook my head slowly. There was nothing to contest. "Your claim was based on a fraudulent document, which is the subject of Civil Complaint 72C-2023, a case which, I assure you, is moving forward. You were never legal stakeholders. You were just noisy." Just then, the doorbell rang, a bright, cheerful chime that cut through the tension. I saw the relief on their faces. They thought it was their lawyer, a last-minute reprieve. I walked to the door and opened it. Standing on the porch was my real estate agent, Susan, and behind her, the young couple I had seen at the showing, their faces bright with excitement. "Frank," Susan said warmly. "This is Dr. and Mrs. Evans. They just wanted to do their final walkthrough before we head to the closing." I stepped aside and welcomed them in. "Please, come in. Welcome to your new home." The Evanses stepped inside, their eyes wide with happiness as they looked around the sun-drenched, empty living room. And then they saw Sarah and Mark, standing frozen in the middle of the room like statues. The air became thick with confusion. Susan looked from me to them, her professional smile tightening. It was in that exact moment that the last ounce of control drained from Mark. His face contorted into a mask of pure, unrestrained fury. He looked at me, his eyes burning with a hatred that was terrifying to see. "You," he seethed, his voice a low, strangled whisper. "You will pay for this." Sarah finally broke. A choked sob escaped her lips as she looked at the happy young couple, then at the empty space where her childhood had unfolded. She looked at me, her eyes swimming with tears. But it was too late. The damage was done. I gave them one last look, a look devoid of anger or pity. It was a look of finality. Then I turned my back on them completely and smiled at the new owners. "Why don't I show you the garden? The morning light is just perfect this time of year." I walked away, leaving my daughter and her husband standing alone in the wreckage of their own greed. The sound of a new family's happy chatter filling the house they thought they had stolen. My new apartment is on the 3rd floor of a quiet building overlooking a small park. It's less than half the size of the house, with just 2 rooms, a small kitchen, and a balcony big enough for a chair, and a few pots of herbs. The air doesn't smell of old memories anymore. It smells of fresh paint and the coffee I brew each morning. The silence here is different too. It's not the heavy, echoing silence of an empty family home, but a light, peaceful quiet that feels like a choice. It's the sound of a new beginning. I didn't bring much with me from the old house, just my clothes, my books, and a few of my tools. And, of course, the armchair. It sits now by the large sliding glass door that leads to the balcony, positioned to catch the morning sun. The movers had a difficult time getting it up the narrow staircase, but I insisted. It looks larger in this smaller space, more significant. It's no longer just a piece of furniture. It's an anchor. After I had it delivered, I spent a whole afternoon cleaning and conditioning the leather myself. My hands, the same hands that built a life, worked to preserve this last, most important piece of it. I found the faint discoloration where the coffee had spilled, a pale ghost of the stain I had scrubbed away. For a moment, I felt a phantom sting of that day's pain, but then it passed, and something else took its place. The mark was no longer a wound. It was a scar. A reminder not of the betrayal, but of the moment I decided to fight back. It was proof that I could be broken and still put myself back together, stronger than before. The legal proceedings concluded quietly. The civil fraud case was undeniable. With the official record of Mark's dissolved company and their saved voicemail messages as evidence, their lawyer advised them to settle. They had to officially withdraw their false claims and were ordered by the court to cover all my legal fees, which amounted to a staggering $28,500. I learned through Susan, my realtor, that they had to sell their own house on Willow Creek Lane to pay the debt. I felt no joy at the news, only a quiet, somber sense of justice. Their greed had cost them the very thing they were trying to steal. I have not spoken to Sarah since that day in the empty house, and I don't know if I ever will. Some things, like a support beam cut in two, simply cannot be repaired. Now my days have a new rhythm. I've set up a small workbench on the balcony. I'm not building big things anymore, just small, intricate birdhouses for the children who play in the park below. The work is precise, calming. The familiar scent of fresh-cut pine wood mingles with the city air. I've learned that a home isn't the 4 walls you live in. It's the dignity you build inside yourself. My old house was an album of my past, but this small apartment is a blank page, and I am the one writing the story now. Every evening I sit in my burgundy armchair. I don't look at a photograph on a mantel anymore. I look out the window, at the city lights twinkling on, at the world moving forward, and for the first time in a long time, I feel like I am moving forward with it. If you liked this story, don't forget to leave your like, subscribe to the channel, and write in the comments what you thought. I really want to know your opinion. Here you will always find stories that move, surprise, and bring lessons to take with you for life. Looking back on it all, I've learned that the loudest people in the room are often the weakest. Their strength is a performance. a brittle veneer covering a hollow core. True strength is quiet, like the grain in a piece of old oak. It's forged by time, pressure, and patience. My daughter and her husband saw my quiet life as a sign of weakness, a resource to be plundered. They never understood that my hands, which spent 40 years building sturdy, honest things, knew how to dismantle a structure built on lies. The greatest lesson in all of this wasn't about money or property, it was about the foundation of a person's character. You can't build a life on greed and disrespect. It will inevitably collapse under its own weight, just as theirs did. My dignity was never for sale, and my home was never just the wood and nails they coveted. It was the honor and the love I built within those walls. They couldn't steal that, because I was the one who built it. Now my life is my own again, a project I am crafting with care. Remember that your self-worth is the one structure you must always protect. Defend it with quiet strength. If you liked this story, don't forget to leave your like, subscribe to the channel, and write in the comments what you thought. I really want to know your opinion. Here you will always find stories that move, surprise, and bring lessons to take with you for life.